The other thing I like about this book is that it points to a truth about spy fiction, which I think distinguishes it from other genres, which is that the very, very close relationship between spy fact and spy fiction. And the huge number of spy authors who, like the fictional Ed Lemaster, who had some kind of involvement in the intelligence world, which is incredible when you think about it. And it's not replicated anywhere else. I mean, how many crime writers have been criminals? How many writers who write about serial killers have been serial killers themselves?
Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Vidic, Graham Greene, Mick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 210 of the Spybrary podcast. Delighted to bring you another episode of our Dead Drop 5 series. This is where our guest is being sent behind the Iron Curtain, and it's his or her chance to share with us which 5 spy books they want to have placed in their Dead Drop at Friedrichshain Park in East Berlin. We also throw in a couple of other items to try and make life a little bit more comfortable for our agents. So, Spybrarians, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our guest on Dead Drop 5 today, David Clarke. Now, David served as former British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook's special advisor from 1997 to 2001. And their professional working relationship dates back even further to their time in opposition, starting in 1994. Prior to this, David pursued a master's degree in war studies at King's College London, with a special focus on, yeah, you've guessed it, intelligence. David Clarke currently works as a political consultant, specializing primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. He possesses a profound professional and intellectual interest in the subject of intelligence. It is an honor to host you on this episode of Spybrary's Dead Drop 5, David.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
So I'm curious, can you share more with us about your route into spy fiction?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very recent thing, but the lead up to it is a long one. I've been, as you say, I've been a student, a consumer, and to some extent a producer of intelligence in different capacities throughout my working life. I did the master's degree at King's College London, and I did the course there on intelligence methods and history under Michael Herman, who'd been a senior GCHQ official and was really one of the leading British experts, academic experts on intelligence. And I found that fascinating because this was the early 90s. The Cold War had just come to an end. The Soviet Union had just disintegrated. I was studying things like Soviet intelligence methods and history, which at that time seemed like a very esoteric subject to a lot of people. But it rang a lot of bells for me because I'm a very political person. I'd been very heavily involved in political activism as a student and through the anti-apartheid movement and other things. And I'd come into contact with lots of different parts of the far left who I could see had been using many of the methods that were being described in the literature on Soviet intelligence, front organizations, penetration operations, deception, all kinds of tricks and so on to fight, often against each other, but also against, the militant tendencies, entryism into the Labour Party in the 1980s. I'd seen that up close. It just fascinated me, the linkages between the subject of intelligence and the practice of intelligence and the political world that I'd been involved in. And of course, it's come around full circle now because the Russians, have basically weaponized that same tradition of active measures, political warfare, call it what you like now, to try and destabilize the countries around it and the West and interfere in our politics. And that's now a major, major aspect of world affairs again. So all of that knowledge that I accumulated at that time has come in extremely useful in terms of understanding the world. And then for 4 years, I was an official at the Foreign Office. I was reading a lot of intelligence material every day, near enough. There would be intelligence reports in my in tray to read. Can't talk about what was in them, obviously, because I signed away a lifetime obligation of confidentiality when I signed the Official Secrets Act. But actually, a lot of that sort of material is now declassified anyway through things like the various Iraq inquiries and so on. People can see for themselves the sorts of material that people in government see for themselves. And since leaving government, I've been involved in many different things, but most of the work that I do now could probably be classified as business intelligence, which sounds probably more sinister than it really is. It's more like journalism than espionage. But I'm still endeavoring to find out things that are not public knowledge to advise corporate clients on their investment strategies and who they're doing business with and things like that. So, all of that is part of the lead up to a point about 5 years ago when I had an idea for a book. I can't really write about what I do in a non-fiction sense not because I'm a great possessor of state secrets, but because commercial confidentiality makes it difficult, apart from anything else. But I thought there might be something there that could be done in a fictional form that would be of interest. Looking at a world in which countries Western institutions are fracturing. A lot of intelligence work is being privatized, actually, through the rise of citizen activism and organizations like Bellingcat, for example. New technology is making citizen-led intelligence much more viable. People can now get access to data, satellite imagery, whatever, data analytics that 10, 15 years ago, you would have had to have very high security clearance at something like the NSA or GCHQ to be able to get your hands on. So technology is changing the nature of intelligence. And I thought there would be an interesting story to be written about that. So I thought what I probably ought to do is read some first. I've never been a great fiction reader. I think probably on average 1 or 2 books a year until about 5 years ago. But I thought I should start reading some spy novels to see if it's something I thought I might be able to do. And I really just got hooked after that. Very quickly got completely sucked in. And I have to blame you partly for that, because after coming into contact with your podcast and then spotting the Facebook page, it's just become a kind of a spiral into this world of spy fiction through the Tim Shipman list and all the other things that go with it. I'm enjoying it immensely, I must say, and I wish I'd started this journey a lot longer ago.
That's part of our mission at Spybree. It's to put good quality spy reads on people's radars, because there's a lot of books out there. We've only got a certain amount of time, and I want to make sure that all our listeners and those in our community get a quality spy book. So 2 questions spring to mind here before we go into your picks. First of all, when you first got into spy fiction, you said you were hooked. What was the first book you read, the first fiction spy novel? Do you remember?
I had read a few before that would qualify spy books, and I read Fatherland by Robert Harris when it came out on its release, and I enjoyed that a lot. The first of my picks I'll talk about in a minute, so I won't give you any spoilers on that. It's a book I read a long time ago, and I've read 2 or 3 times since.
Well, we can dig into that one if you like. We can go straight to book one.
We'll go into that. I did read one Le Carre. I read Absolute Friends when it came out, because I was interested in a book on the War on Terror, and I know it's a favourite of yours. So because of that, I am going to reread it. But at the time, it didn't really appeal to me. I felt that Le Carre had got the War on Terror wrong. Or at least the book, it seemed to me, he conceived of the book before 9/11, and had then repurposed the story to make it about 9/11. And I thought that was a little bit obvious to me, and therefore it didn't quite work, and it didn't quite drag me in. But I've now read 10 other Le Carre books, and I find them gripping. The best of them are really the best of what's in the genre, no question about it. But I will revisit Absolute Friends because of your championing of it. for sure.
It's interesting, that book, because the first time I actually listened to it on audiobook, and I always say this to folks that Le Carre actually narrates it. So it's abridged, so it's not the whole book, so it's a good way of getting into it, because it is a long book. It's a long read. It was just the way that he's a fantastic narrator. I don't know if you've listened to any of his audiobooks, David.
The Pigeon Tunnel, I've listened to that. Yeah. And his voice is incredible. It really is. I mean, it's a wholly different experience, I think, to hear it read by him.
Yeah.
I did read the book when it came out, but listening to him read it, gives it an extra dimension.
He's a great mimic as well, isn't he? He mimics other voices. And I read in the Sisman biography that his dad, as we all know, was a bit of a crook, used to take young David to certain events and meet these actors and celebrities in London, and he would get his dad would get him to do impressions of people, to a point where some of those comics and stand-up comedians, etc., got a little bit annoyed that he was young David was overshadowing them, upstaging them rather, with his and I've often thought about Le Carre. I thought, if he wasn't a spy and then a writer, I wonder if he would have become an actor, because he's very, very good at it,
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, he's got that quality about him.
Yes. But I have to keep my powder dry on Absolute Friends, because I know a friend of the show, Jeff Quest, wants me to go on the Le Carre cast to talk about Absolute Friends. So I'll keep that for Jeff's show. The second question I've got for you, and if it's one of your picks, we can go into that later. But with your background of reading intelligence reports, so when you read fiction, is there any time you read a book or an author and think, wow, they're quite close to the way that the real intelligence world worked? Or more authentic? Does it seem to you that this is actually rather authentic?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I obviously I've got no real experience of that at a field level or an operational level, but so. The bits that resonate with me most are the ones where they're describing sort of bureaucratic infighting. And of course, Le Carre goes into that better than anyone. The one thing I do sometimes find a bit odd with Le Carre is that the dialogue, the way people speak to each other, is not familiar to me from my experience of that world, but maybe he's really, describing or portraying how Mandarins talked to each other at the time when he was there in the 60s. I was there more than 30 years later. But people didn't really speak to each other in the way that, Smiley talks to, some of his colleagues. There's a certain sort of ring to the way Le Carre portrays it, which isn't familiar to me. But the sort of the backbiting and the positioning and the back covering and all of that kind of stuff that he describes is certainly familiar. Not just to the world of espionage, but to sort of public service generally and politics, actually.
It seems to me that every spy has an issue with a boss that is actually very lazy and doesn't really understand their remit and gets them to do all the work for them, and then they take the credit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, and McCarran makes this point as well. The spy world is just office politics with secrecy. Yeah. It's in many ways, and so if you're familiar with how the dynamics of office politics, then you're most of the way to understanding how it works, really.
Have you read Graham Greene's The Human Factor?
Not yet. It's on my to-be-read pile.
Yeah,
so it's one I'm looking forward to.
There's a lot of bureaucracy and infighting and stuff, and I think that Greene did a really good job of that. And of course, as we know, he was involved for a time, so probably from personal experience. But let's dive into book one, David. What's the first book you want us to stash for you in East Berlin?
Well, first of all, just to explain how I've chosen the five, because it's something that will run through all of them, rather than pick my favorite five books or favorite five authors, I've decided to sort of pick books which I think represent different qualities, one or more of the qualities which I find particularly attractive in spy fiction. The five books that I've chosen will illustrate, hopefully, what I mean by that as we go along. The first book is one, as I said, that I've read before my current fixation. I think I must have read it maybe 25 years ago for the first time, and I've read it, I think, 3 times in total, most recently a couple of years ago. And it's actually one of the earliest books in the genre. written in 1907, and it's The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. And for those of you who haven't read it or are not familiar with it, the basic plot summary is it's based around an anarchist plot to blow up the Greenwich Observatory, which is actually inspired by a real incident that happened in the Victorian period, where a French anarchist blew himself up carrying a bomb towards the observatory. And Conrad constructed a story around this about a foreign diplomat from an unidentified foreign country, but is very obviously Russia, because the diplomat's called Mr. Vladimir, and he organizes this provocation, as they would call it, to discredit political refugees based in London in order to force their expulsion. And he uses an agent provocateur called Verloc, who is in his pay, very reluctantly conscripts him into this plot with thinly veiled threats about what might happen to him if his cover was blown. And he encourages this plot. It proceeds. The plot doesn't succeed. Verloc's accomplice in this, who he's conscripted into it without really knowing what it's all about, which is the brother of his wife, a young man, is killed in the process, and everything just unravels from there. The plot, who was behind it, Verloc's role in it. I won't spoil it for those who haven't read it, how it ends. But it's fascinating for a number of reasons. I love the atmosphere of it. That's a very important part of spy fiction for me. It conjures up really that feeling of being in the sort of the London emigre political community of the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. Emigre politics, revolutionary politics in particular, its interplay with the state agencies and the spies who are trying to keep tabs on them or to exploit them, and the politics of it at that time. It's one of the reasons why the book has enduring relevance. It became particularly common to talk about its relevance at the time of 9/11, because terrorism is a major theme of the book. But I think now the relevance of it is that it describes what in effect is a Cold War that takes place between Russia and Britain. Before people talk about this as being the Second Cold War, but before the First World War, there was another Cold War in the late Victorian period, where Britain and Russia very nearly came to war, precisely because of the role that Russian revolutionary refugees were playing in Britain. So that the dynamic that Conrad is describing is a very real one, and also one of contemporary relevance, because we are back again in a situation where we're fighting a kind of proxy war with Russia, without a direct confrontation, using many of the methods that Conrad describes.
Tell us about the writing style, about Conrad's writing. So you've already said that he evokes a really good atmosphere of its time, but what's his writing style like for those of us who aren't familiar with him?
Well, it's told in the third person, and I'm not sure how I would describe its writing style. It doesn't, unlike a lot of books from that period, it doesn't feel dated at all. I mean, I've read books, 10, 20 years after Conrad wrote this that really haven't held up very well at all. But the voice of and maybe it helps because Conrad is English wasn't his first language, but his style isn't dated at all. Doesn't seem to me to be dated. It's quite so you don't feel as if you're reading a book that's more than a century old necessarily. But it's he doesn't. It's not flowery in its use of language at all. I think if it had been, then it wouldn't have travelled as well, because obviously, elaborate language is a fashion of the moment in terms of how you write things. So it probably would have dated more if he'd been more elaborate. But it's a very accessible style, I would describe it.
Without going down spoiler strasse, are there any quotes or scenes that stood out to you?
Yeah, very much so. I think there's one scene that I always come back to, and it features the assistant commissioner of the police, who has overall responsibility for the inquiry into the investigation into the bombing. And he has a sort of coded confrontation with Mr. Vladimir outside as they're leaving a gentleman's club, in which the assistant commissioner basically says, "We know it was you that did this." And they have a sort of set to verbally. And it's incredibly relevant now, because what Mr. Vladimir says is that I've always felt that we should be good Europeans, men and countries. And what he means by this is that Russia was playing the role of standing up for authority, for religion, for order, against the forces of chaos represented by these revolutionary refugees who are trying to overthrow the order, not just of Russia, but of other European countries as well. So he's basically saying to the assistant commissioner, "We're doing you a favor. You don't realize it. We're doing you a favor. We're doing the right thing. We're defending Europe." And the assistant commissioner's response is, "But you see Europe from the other end." And what he's meaning is both geographically and ideologically. What he's saying is that we see liberty as being more important than your concept of order. The authoritarian methods that you're using are ones that we would never use. And therefore, that's why we provide refuge to political exiles who are being victimized in their own countries, and will continue to do so. And it's really these two poles of European, two different ways of being European at opposite ends of the pole. The British idea of democracy and liberty, and the Russian idea of authority and order are still relevant now, because that dynamic is still playing out.
Definitely. In terms of the genre of spy, right, so as we've talked many times on this show previously, on the one side you've got the actioneer stuff, and then on the other end of the scale you've got the more realistic, gritty kind of spy novel. Where would you place The Secret Agent on that diagram?
Well, my preference is very much for the heroes who solve problems with their minds, not with their fists or with weapons. As soon as a gun comes out, I tend to sort of switch off. Really, I'm not interested in that. The key for me is that it's intelligence. It's supposed to be a battle of minds, really. I've always been, before I got interested in spy fiction, I would say, one of the kinds of forms of fiction I did enjoy was the Sherlock Holmes stories for the same reason. I'm very attracted to this idea that you can do battle with your brain, and that's the most powerful weapon.
Yeah.
I don't completely rule out an element of action in spy fiction, but it has to be very subordinate to the main activity, which is about winning through brain power.
How did you feel after finishing the book? Intrigued enough to sort of want to read more about it. So, I have read quite a lot now about the history of that period and some of the stuff around it. Another book is in a similar vein, slightly different, but it covers some of the same issues that I like a lot. Is G.K. Chesterton's book, The Man Who Was Thursday, and that's that's a bit more of a farce. And I was tempted to put that in my top in the five. But it's too similar, I think, in terms of the ground that it covers to The Secret Agent. And between the two, I think Conrad gets it for me, just because of its enduring relevance and the themes that it tackles. But yeah, it certainly piqued my interest. And I actually think that if there's a period of history in which is underexplored by spy fiction, it is that period of the late 19th and early 20th century, because there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. A lot of the things that we talk about now in the spy world really have their origins in that period. Disinformation, for example, the use of deception, penetration agents, all of that was going on at that time. And it's a fascinating subject, and there isn't enough written about it either in fiction or in non-fiction, actually. Our friend Andy Onyx recorded a brush pass on the Chesterton book, and I will add a link to that in the show notes, which we can find at spybrary.com/210. Okay, let's move on to your second choice, David. Which is the second book you'd like us to stash away for you?
My second choice is a book by Eric Ambler. He's obviously one of the sort of major figures in the genre historically. But rather than go for any of the ones that people might be familiar with, I've chosen one that's I often overlooked, and it's The Intercom Conspiracy, which I absolutely love. And the qualities in the book that really appeal to me in it are, well, first of all, innovative. It's an innovative plot, very innovative plot. That's important to me. Anything that's got a little bit out of the ordinary about it is of interest to me. And humor. It's a sort of it has a feeling of the quality of the sort of 1960s, 1970s caper movie. You know, it's not a comedy exactly, but it's got elements of farce about it.
When was it published?
It was written in 1969.
Okay.
And I'm going in a bit to describe why I think, what that's linked to, because it wasn't the only example of it. There was a sort of spate of things around that time, and I think it had to do with developments in world politics at that time. That shift. It also has an interesting format, which I like. It's a novel in the epistolary format, which means that it's written as a series of documents, presented as a series of documents rather than a single narrative. And I've only come across one other example in the spy fiction genre that does this, and that's the Meyernick dossier by Charles McCarry, which I also like a lot for the same reason. I find that format really quite intriguing. I know that the so-called Harry Palmer novels are supposedly presented as dossiers, but they're not really proper epistolary novels, because they're not actually, when you read them, they're not actually written as if they were documents. It's just a way of presenting the book. So those don't, as much as I love those, and I do, they don't really count in the sense of this kind of format. So unless anybody knows of any other examples, those are the only two: The Intercom Conspiracy and the Meyernick dossier. The plot is intriguing. It's two retiring spy chiefs from small NATO countries who feel overlooked and undervalued and sneered at by their colleagues. So they devise a revenge blackmail scheme, by which they hope to provide lots of money for their retirement, and also to get revenge on the people they think have been responsible for belittling them. They buy what was quite common in those days, a subscription newsletter. This is pre-internet days.
Wow.
It was a subscription newsletter called Intercom, which was based in Geneva. Anonymously, they buy this thing, and then they use it through its editor and a cutout, who's a lawyer who represents their interest to the editor of this newsletter, to leak information embarrassing to the intelligence services of East and West, with the intention that eventually one or more of them will decide that they need to shut this thing down, and will therefore pay for it to be shut down. That's basically it. And it features this sort of the usual Ambler device of the innocent man caught in the middle of this great game of espionage, unwittingly. A guy called Theodore Carter, who's the editor of this newsletter, and as soon as he starts leaking information via the newsletter, is basically threatened and menaced by spies from lots of different countries who turn up in Geneva to try and put pressure on him. So that's basically it. It's got lots and lots of different things that I really like about spy novels. In terms of the humor and the innovative plot.
Can you describe the humor? In particular, is there a quote or a scene that particularly made you laugh out loud?
Well, there are various bits where poor Theodore Carter's descent into this world that he didn't even realize he'd become part of. Various agents turning up to try and do him in or shut him up or whatever. That's good, but it's just the sort of the conceit of it. This idea that two spy chiefs would devise a scheme as mischievous as this is very appealing, and the way they carry it off is also quite appealing. And I think it's to do with there was a few of these at the time. I mean, another example, the film, not the book, Hopscotch, for example, which the book itself, I gather, I haven't read, but I'm planning to, is slightly darker. But the film version is played as a comedy, and I think it was to do with two things really. One was was détente at that time, and also the Vietnam War and Watergate. In many people's minds, sort of closed the distance between the West and our perception of ourselves and the Soviet Union. People were starting to say, are there really major differences? Aren't we all really just involved in this absurd game? And there were two responses. One was comedy, as represented by this book and by things like Hopscotch, the film, and the other was cynicism and conspiracy, represented by various different films of that period, such as 3 Days of the Condor and so on. This idea that we were closer to being like each other in a way that was absurd, or we were closer to being like each other in a way that was extremely sinister. I think it's interesting to look at how, for me, how the sense of how the Cold War was going, shaped fictional responses to it.
For those who are not familiar with Ambler, how would you describe his writing style?
Well, it's changed. I mean, this book was written in '69. The only other Ambler book I've read is Cause for Alarm, which was written in 1938, I think. And the style of writing is completely different. Right. I found that the Cause for Alarm, that the kind of writing there really had dated a lot. It did sound, slightly sort of caricatured, sort of English middle class ways of talking that I found rather difficult to identify with. As much I like the book, don't get me wrong, but I felt that it hadn't aged very well. This was a much more modern piece, in a recognizably modern tone of voice. And also the fact that it was written as a series of documents rather than as a sort of joined up single narrative, I think changed it a little bit as well. And that's really the key, I think, and this is why I suppose people tend not to write epistolary novels now, is because you have to write in multiple different voices and in multiple different cadences in order to carry it off. Charles McCarry does it brilliantly in the Marnik Dossier, by the way. It must have been a huge effort to try and pivot from writing something that is 1 minute an official government internal document, and the next minute writing something which is a press clipping, just for example, and then in the next chapter have something which ostensibly is the transcript of a surveillance recording. So it's a difficult thing to do. But fascinating to read, and when it's done well, it does make for a really great book, I think. Well,
I'm sold, and as much as I love Dead Drop 5, the danger is I end up spending lots of money because there's books that I haven't read, and that would definitely stands out to me. As soon as we're done with this, I'm going to go and track down a copy.
Are you on the hunt for your next thrilling spy read? Look no further. Spybury contributor and Sunday Times chief political commentator Tim Shipman has curated a list of his top 125 spy authors ranked. With Tim's vast experience and expertise in politics and spy thrillers, you can trust his judgment on the best spy authors of all time. This list includes both classic and modern writers, making it the ultimate guide for any spy fan. But wait, there's more. Tim also recommends which book to try first from each author, and he shares his favourite book from each of them too, so you can dive right into the best of the best. Ready to get your hands on Tim's list? Head over to spybury.com/top125 to grab your free copy now. Don't miss out on the ultimate spy reading list. Visit spybury.com/top125 today.
So let's move on to your third pick, David. What's number 3?
Well, the third pick is probably one that I think a lot of Spybrarians will have read for obvious reasons. It's The Double Game by Dan Fesperman, which has the qualities about this that I like. One is a very innovative plot, which I'll describe in a moment for those who haven't read it, and a certain playfulness that comes with it. It's not a comedy book, but there's a playfulness about the book which I find really engaging. And the plot basically is a middle-aged American PR executive who gets drawn into an espionage mystery when he's sent an anonymous note accusing a famous spy novelist called Ed LeMaster of having been a Cold War double agent. LeMaster had been in the intelligence service. He'd been a CIA officer, and this PR executive had interviewed LeMaster when he was a journalist, and LeMaster had made some oblique reference to the possibility that he may have been a double agent, but it had gone no further than that. But this anonymous note said, "You were right, he was," and contained in it clues to how this secret could be uncovered. And the guy then goes off on a kind of road trip through Europe. It's a kind of road trip in the form of a mole hunt to try and uncover the truth about Ed LeMaster's past, which takes him through various parts of Central Europe, beginning in Vienna, up to Prague, then down to Budapest, in which spy books, the whole sort of corpus of the spy genre becomes part of the story, part of the narrative. Clues are left in bookshops, and pages of books turn up at Centum or whatever, are left at particular points where he would be in order to point him in the direction that he needed to go to uncover the truth. And it's all tied up with his father, who was a huge spy fiction collector and had also been a US diplomat based in Europe and had known Ed LeMaster. So his relationship with his father is part of it. He hooks up with an old sweetheart from the time that he was living in Vienna with his father, and they go off together, and it's partly about their relationship. And it's just a really fun book for anybody who enjoys the genre. It's a kind of it's an appreciation of it. The sort of genre is turned into a work of fiction itself. And the way he does it, the way he pieces it all together, is really quite masterful, I think. It also has a great appendix, the book, which lists 222 different works of spy fiction. It's a kind of prototype of the Shipman list, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. See, this is the other danger of Dead Drop 5. I have read Double Game, but now you've got me excited to go back and read it again. But I remember the first time, and it was a Spybrary recommendation, and I was working my way through it and thought, maybe I should read a book from each of these authors in the same way we look at the Shipman list and Mike Ripley's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. But I'd have to live to 250 or something to get through the whole lot, right?
Yeah, there isn't enough life left, unfortunately. I've come to this too late.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I like about this book is that it points to a truth about spy fiction, which I think distinguishes it from other genres, which is that the very, very close relationship between spy fact and spy fiction. And the huge number of spy authors who, like the fictional Ed LeMaster, who had some kind of involvement in the intelligence world, which is incredible when you think about it. And it's not replicated anywhere else. I mean, how many crime writers have been criminals? How many writers who write about serial killers have been serial killers themselves? Not many, none that we know of, anyway. So it's a genre that is much more closely related to the topic and subject matter that it covers than any other, I think.
And what did you think of Fesperman's writing style?
Yeah, I like it. It's very fresh. It's very it's very well presented. I'm reading his most recent book, Winter Work, at the moment, and again, it's just really well written. It's a very crisp writing style, very accessible, easy to follow, very engaging as well. He draws characters extremely well.
Yeah, and his work is interesting to me. So there's him, Paul Vidic, David McCloskey, and they're Americans. And we often kind of joke on Spybrary that a lot of the spy books we read are written by British authors. But we've got this crop of writers now in the US who I would say are almost writing in a British style, but bringing an American perspective, if you will, but very much in that style that we've all grown to love. How did you feel about that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a divide in the genre between sort of the action type books and the more sort of intellectual heavy books. But that divide doesn't run down the Atlantic. I think it runs through the middle of America, because there are plenty of American writers, as you say, and not just recent ones like the ones you mentioned, but also Charles McCarry, for example, who writes in a very smart and intellectually engaging style. He's not of the sort of explosions and gun battles kind of school of spy fiction writing at all. He makes much more intellectual demands on his reader than that. So I think that's always been there. And the final author that I'll mention in my final book, he's American as well, and he very much belongs to the clever, I think, tradition of spy writing.
Yeah, absolutely. What would your fourth pick be then?
The fourth pick will be no surprise to anybody who's full of my comments on the Facebook page, is Big Bear, Little Bear by David Burley.
I'm so glad you picked that one. I was praying you would.
Which, I think as soon as I read it, really drew me in. And the thing about it, two things I like about it most is the atmosphere of it is tremendous. You really do feel like you're in the middle of the period that he's describing, the situation that he's describing. He carries off really well that sense of menace that any field agent must feel when they're on the ground operating in conditions of physical threat. He describes that extremely well, and it's got great tradecraft. That's the other thing. Many good spy novels have great trade descriptions of tradecraft, and I like that. In this book in particular, I think he does it very well. And I was surprised listening to your interview with him that you did ask him how he managed to combat it. I thought he was going to say that he had some great insight into how it was done, but he didn't really seem to know himself actually for how he'd come up with this stuff. And but it sounds so authentic. It really does have the feel of being there on the ground. He's got this great phrase that he uses when he talks about the characters smelling his own sweat, by which he means looking over his shoulder, putting his nose towards his armpit to sort of see if he's being followed. And he uses that phrase sort of repetitively, and it's a unique phrase to that book, I think. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but it's that gives it a kind of an urgency, an authenticity that I like. The summary, the plot, it's about a British spy called Oris who has to escape from Czechoslovakia when his network is blown just as the communists are seizing power in 1948. And he returns to London, where somebody tries to assassinate him. And on this basis, he comes to believe that there is a mole operating at a senior position in his own organization who blew his network in Czechoslovakia. And in order to try and flush this mole out, he goes on the run in East Berlin, of all places, during the weeks running up to the start of what was the Berlin airlift in 1948. That's the title, Big Bear, Little Bear. The Big Bear is Russia, Little Bear is Berlin. And he's in Berlin just as all this conflict between the Soviet Union and the West is escalating there. And it's a great battle of wits story. I just love the way it's all mapped out and how it unfolds. It's quite similar in some ways to Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but looked at from the bottom rather than the guy pursuing this mole hunt isn't the spy chief, spy master, and this mining mole. He's a field agent trying to uncover a mole from the bottom up. And the writing in it is extremely good. It's just really, really crisp writing, and very refreshing to read. I've read his most recent book, Dead Man Telling Tales, and his writing style has changed actually. But his new book is every bit as good. He's got a much stronger authorial voice, I think, than Big Bear, Little Bear. More humor, I think. But for those who, I know a lot of people are struggling to get copies of Big Bear, Little Bear, but if you can't, then his latest book is also great, and I'd encourage people to go out and get a copy of that.
Yeah, come on, Mike Ripley. I know you're listening. Let's get Big Bear, Little Bear out on Kindle, etc. Let's get it back out to the masses, because I'm always very nervous in the Spybury community when I really big up a book, because we all have different tastes, etc. But I was really relieved that I read Big Bear, Little Bear because Mike Ripley, author of Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, had recommended it to me because he knows about my love for Berlin-based spy thrillers, and he shared with me that Len Dayton had come across Big Bear, Little Bear in a secondhand bookstore in Los Angeles and then read it and recommended it to him. So I'm like, okay, if those two legends are recommending this, I better get onto it, and thoroughly loved the book. I mean, that opening is one of the best openings of any spy thriller, when, his treff goes wrong in Prague and he finds himself, he's sleeping under a load of leaves under a tree, and he's on the run. And as you say, and I don't want to go into any spoiler territory, but how he uses his wits, past acquaintances, to survive. I'm curious, though, what your feeling was. There's a scene when he gets back to London and he gets home, and he's pinned down by a sniper. How did that work for you?
Yeah, it worked fine. I mean, I didn't have any problem with it myself.
I just asked that. Sorry, I just asked it because I know what you mentioned earlier on about guns in spy books, etc. But I wondered how that sequence worked for you.
No, I don't mind that at all, because I mean that's necessary in order to set up the whole idea that there's a battle of wits taking place. If it was the case that every other chapter there was a gun battle or whatever, I would find that very off-putting. But if a sense of physical threat is essential to the plot, then I don't mind that featuring at all. So yeah, I didn't have a problem with that. But the one thing I do agree with you about, though, is that I very much have a preference for books set during the Cold War. I think the Cold War lends itself to the best of spy literature in a way that I don't think many other periods do. I have enjoyed and read books set in the post-Cold War period, as David Brilley's new book is, and I do enjoy some of that, but I always go back to the Cold War period. I just think it's even more than the Second World War or War on Terror or any other context. I think it really sort of it brings out the best of what I like in spy fiction.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, we could spend a whole hour talking about Big Bear, Little Bear. Maybe we should do that at a future episode, because there's a lot to unpack in that. But huge fan myself, and I know I need to get to his latest book. It's waiting on my Kindle. I need to get it. But I did also read, it was quite interesting. So I believe he wrote a book in 1979 called Cold War, and he introduced a female character called Cody. And I did read that one. Not as good as Big Bear, Little Bear. Still an enjoyable read, but at that time, or even now, we often struggle to find a writer who can portray females very well in spy thriller. And back in 1979, he actually did a very good job of that. And in some ways, it reminded me, because I just read a Modesty Blaze book, because our friend Jason King was saying it's one of the ones you must read before you die. And although Cody isn't Modesty Blaze, there were a lot of similarities in that, they could defend themselves, they could look after themselves, but in a realistic way.
Yeah, it's on my wish list. I've got a couple of other of his older books in my to be read pile, which so I will get around to that one eventually. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Brilliant. What's your fifth pick?
Well, actually this one relates to something you just said about female characters in books, because this one features a particularly good one. It's The Debriefing by Robert Little. who, as I said, he's an American author, but very much in the best tradition of spy writing, one that is, intellectually engaging and not just simply, using guns and car chases and so on to create thrills in the easy way. And the things I like about this book are, again, it has a very innovative plot. It features a lot of politics. It's one of the reasons I like spy literature is that it's probably the most political kind of literature. And by that I mean not just high politics of conflict between states and so on, but also sort of interagency politics. And this book features a lot of interagency politics, which is interesting and fun. It's got very good tradecraft. The way that which the business process of spying is described is really quite engaging. It really draws you in, and the writing is great. He's got a really wonderful humanistic quality about his writing that comes through in his characters very strongly. The plot summary is that there is an elite undercover covert U.S. military intelligence unit that is given the job of finding out whether a recent KGB defector is genuine or a plant. Obviously, drawing on some of the famous episodes in American espionage history and Nosenko Golitsyn stuff. But the book is in two parts. Really, the first part of the book is the defection and the interviews between the main protagonist, Stone, who's the guy who runs this military intelligence unit and is given the job of finding out the truth about whether or not this defector, Oleg Kulakov, is real or not. So the first part is his interview over a period of many months, interviews with Kulakov over a period of many months, in which he tries to piece together this guy's story to work out whether it's genuine or not. And the second part of the book is when Stone basically comes to the view that he'll never be able to get to the truth unless he goes to the Soviet Union himself, which he does. He goes undercover in the Soviet Union. And tracks down various people who can help him piece together, the story of Kulakov's defection. And the second part of the book is both parts are great, but the second part of the book is really, it's very similar in feel to Big Bear, Little Bear, because you get the feel that you're on the run with him, really operating behind enemy lines. The characters are great. There's a female prostitute called Katushka, and this actually comes up as a piece of tradecraft in several different novels. He hooks up with her because it's a way of remaining off the grid. He could find somewhere to stay in which he wouldn't need to provide identity. In other words, he forms up a partnership with her, essentially, stays with her and uses her place as a base from which to operate from. And she's a fantastic character. I think she's probably my favorite character in spy fiction so far. The way that she's described is just wonderful. She's funny. She's very warm, very human. Just has a very interesting way of looking at the world, looking at her relationship with Stone. Relating to the people around her, at the end of it, you think, well, if I were to go out for a few drinks with somebody, you'd want to do it with somebody like that, just so kind of funny and full of, interesting thoughts and ideas. And there's another character who shares her apartment building called Morning Stalin. Who has this name because in his previous role he was a double for Stalin, because Stalin didn't like to get up in the mornings, so this guy who was a lookalike would be sent into meetings to play Stalin in the morning, and he was now retired, obviously, but he's part of this sort of circle of people that Stone becomes involved with, and he's very funny as well. He's a very funny character. Yeah, and what comes across, I think, is Little's deep fondness for Russia, the way he talks about Russia. He obviously has a very deep knowledge of the country, and he writes about it wonderfully. and that makes it a really special book, I think.
Do you know much about his background?
I don't know. I mean, I've got a few more of his books which I'm planning to read. This is the first and only one that I've read so far.
Yeah.
But he's been writing a long time. I mean, this book was written, I think, in the early 80s. And I think his earliest books were written in the 70s. And I think he's still writing now. I don't know if he's got any more coming out. But I mean, his most recent book was written a couple of years ago, I think. So he's still active.
Yeah, I've only read one of his. I say read, I listened to it, actually. It was The Company. And I say listen to it because I think it was 30-something hours long. And it really helped me one summer when I was trying to get my steps in. I thought, right, I can't, when you get into a good book on Audible, and it's good to help you with exercise. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. And actually, I've got the TV series to watch, which I've been warned is not that great. So I'm going in with low expectations. But I've got that. I thoroughly enjoyed The Company.
Yes, I've got the book, and I plan to read it. It's quite a big book. So,
yes.
I'll need to, summon up the enthusiasm to take out a significant block of time to read it. Because what I never do with fiction is start one before I finish the last one.
Yeah.
And I never don't finish a book. That's the other thing I won't do. Once I've picked a book up, I have to finish it. However difficult it is sometimes, if you're applying through something that isn't that engaging or get bogged down a little bit, I have to complete. But with non-fiction books, I'll read several concurrently, but not with fiction, because the stories get too jumbled up.
I'm totally with you on that. So I'm curious then, how do you source good books to read? Because there's nothing worse than if you're going to stick with a book for all 300 pages and it's naff. Are you a lot more diligent in terms of what you pick out?
I suppose I am a bit choosier about what I start reading. Because I have that approach, I wouldn't probably start a book I wasn't reasonably confident about, liking. But I rely on, the Spybury community, Tim Shipman's list, lots of other different sources. I quite like finding things that nobody else has mentioned before. I do spend probably too much time in secondhand bookshops, looking for new gems that might have been overlooked by other people. And there have been one or two that I've found that I like. I've got one or two in my to be read list, which I'm planning to get around to. That's fun as well. I try to mix it up a bit. I tend to have a cycle of different kinds of books. I'll read something from an author that I've read before that I liked. I'll read something new that I haven't read before from Tim Shipman's list. I'll read something that I've found for myself, and then I'll sort of circle back again to going an author with a series that I've already explored.
It's interesting you mentioned that the Company is a big book, and it is, and I also had the same feeling going into it, which is why I listened to it. However, at the end of that book, and I think it was 30 odd hours, as I said, of listening time, I missed those characters. I was gutted when it ended. It was that strongly written, and the characters so convincing that it was sad.
Yeah. There are quite a few books, long books, on my to be read list, and I probably shouldn't find it discouraging, but I'm probably more reluctant to start a long book than a short book.
Yeah.
Precisely because of the way that I do it, and this compulsion to complete. Because I know once I'm in, I'm committed. I have to finish.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So we're a few more items that we're allowing you to pick up over in East Berlin. So is there a piece of music that you would particularly enjoy?
Yeah, I spy-related music. I probably one option would be the soundtrack for 3 Days of the Condor, with Dave Grusin's soul, funk, jazz score for that film is just incredible in terms of building its atmosphere and locating it in that period. It's a really great piece of music, but probably not suitable for Cold War East Berlin. The period of music that I really most identify with was the period of my youth, from sort of 76 to 81. That punk, new wave, ska period. that's my kind of music, really, my original kind of music anyway. So if I was to take something, it would probably be a mixtape. But on that would be Holidays in the Sun by the Sex Pistols, because obviously it references the Berlin Wall. So it's relevant. As well as being that was my entry point into music was I was still quite young. I would have been 11 when the Sex Pistols were going 11, 12, but we listened to that album sort of repeatedly at the house of a friend who had an older brother who had a copy, and we used to listen to it on repeat. And that was it was like that sort of Wizard of Oz kind of moments of sort of walking from a world of black and white into a world of color. Hearing that for the first time was was really something. So I always identify with that music.
Brilliant. And, there's a fair bit of punk going on in East Berlin as well. So, Feeling Beard, a few others, so you can get your punk on in East Berlin. What about booze? So let's say, we can stash a good bottle of something under that bush for you, that bench in Friedrichshain. What would you like?
This is quite a spy mission. Music and booze. It's more like a stag weekend than a mission. In fact, that'd be a great plot for a story, wouldn't it be? A spy mission using a stag weekend as cover. Lots of comic potential in that. Well, I like a malt whiskey. Being a Scotsman, obviously, a nice Islay malt would appeal. But that's more of a sort of at home enjoying, at your leisure kind of tipple. I suppose my field drink of choice would be grappa, because I've got a very good friend of mine, a contact who has been extremely useful to me over many years, that I meet up with quite regularly at different points and places in Europe, and when we meet, we always drink grappa. So that's my field drink.
Fantastic. If you could recruit any spy, fictional or in the real world, to exfiltrate you, to come rescue you, and the chips are down, who would you call? Who would you want?
Well, I'm tempted to go counterintuitively for Fred Leiser in Looking Glass War, because he's so inept that he would distract the Vopos to give me an opportunity to get away. I mean, it's a tragic tale, that one. Really, it's a bleak book. I got something out of it. So it's not an easy read, but precisely because of the tragic quality of it, it's really it's hard. So that's one option. But ideally, you'd be looking for somebody with great tradecraft. There's a book that I don't see mentioned very often by Oliver Harris called A Shadow Intelligence, which I can't forget the name of the protagonist in that. He has great tradecraft and how he moves around from place to place, evading surveillance, evading his own people, evading the opposition. But that's sort of very modern kind of tradecraft. That's high tech, online sort of tradecraft. Probably not relevant for the period that we're talking about. I think if you wanted somebody who could get you in and out of places reliably, it would be Oris, really. The way he gets out of Czechoslovakia, and having done that, then plunges right back into East Berlin, and manages to sort of move around and stay, at least one step ahead of his opponents. That's impressive. So Oris would be my choice, I think.
Excellent. We're allowing you to take or to have one luxury item of your choice stashed in your dead drop. What would you pick?
Well, I'm glued to my iPad. I really couldn't do without my iPad, but obviously there weren't any iPads in the period.
Well, we can allow it. I've
got a better idea.
Go for it.
One that's more sort of, at least in fiction, a fictional sense from the period, and it's the cigarette lighter from Our Man Flint. I don't know if you're familiar with that film.
Many years ago,
Flint had this cigarette lighter which had 82 functions. 80, and he said his line was 83 if you count lighting cigars. And this lighter could do anything. It had various devices for killing people or breaking into things or whatever. It was just sort of obviously a piece of kit like that doesn't exist, and it was slightly done as a kind of tongue-in-cheek poking of fun at the whole sort of James Bond Q gadget kind of idea. But if I could have one thing, it would be that cigarette lighter.
Talking of films and movies, if we could slip one DVD in that Dead Drop for you? Is there a particular spy movie you would appreciate?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of great spy movies. I mean, long before I was reading spy fiction, I was watching films, right from when I was a kid, and I always make time for a spy film. For me, I mean, lots of potential candidates, but for me, 3 Days of the Condor is the best spy film that's ever been made. It really has that sort of incredible quality about it, that sense of darkness, and paranoia of the post-Watergate US period. This idea that, your own side was potentially more of a threat to you than the opposition. The great line in the film, what is the CIA inside the CIA? I love that as a plot premise. I love that kind of, circles within circles kind of idea. And it's got a great cast. I mean, the acting in it is just is great. I've read the book as well. I like the book. And I'm going to read more James Grady, but my first introduction was via the film, and it's a great film.
It is. George Orris has come because you've been blown. He's come to rescue you. You want to bring all your books with you, but George is saying you can only take one. Which of these 5 are you bringing with you, David?
Well, there's a case for the double game because it's like it's like the whole genre in one book, or at least bits of the whole genre in one book, and I do like that. But I think if I was to take one, it would be the one I keep going back to, the one I read first, which is The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad.
Marvelous. Who would you like to hear next on Dead Drop 5?
I don't know, actually. I imagine that when you get spy authors on, you want to talk about their books rather than the books they've read. But it would be quite nice to listen to some spy authors talk about, what works have inspired them. Charles Cumming or something like that would be quite interesting to hear talking in this format. But also, I don't know what about celebrities who do we know of any celebrities who are interested in spy fiction, have a particular affinity with spy fiction? I don't know.
Yeah. The one I'd love to interview is Matthew McFadden, the actor. He was just in Stonehouse. He's in Succession. He's all over the place here. But apparently he's a big fan of Le Carré and the spy genre. So, but now, he's been in this huge show, Succession. I don't know if he'll come down to the Spybury level, but we can try, right?
That is a problem. I mean, somebody else who I think appreciates spy fiction is Quentin Tarantino, because you'd never get him. But didn't he at one point think about adapting the Dayton novels?
Yes, the Sampson series.
Yeah.
I
mean, he obviously is interested in spy fiction.
Quilla fan as well. He's a Quilla fan, and in fact, I'll drop this link in the show notes. One of our listeners, Quentin Tarantino has a video. It's something called Video Archives Podcast, and they review these old movies and they talk about the Quilla Memorandum. It's worth a listen.
Ah, right.
About that movie. Another Berlin Cold War.
Yep.
for you. David, do you have a blog or anywhere or social that people can follow you, or are you one of these spy barons who likes to lurk in the shadows?
I don't. I have a Twitter feed, but most of that is just me shouting at people about politics rather than sort of talking about spy fiction. So you won't get much to enlighten you about our favourite subject here by following me on Twitter. But please do if you feel the urge. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I mention spy fiction, but mostly it's me getting annoyed about the state of the world.
What's your Twitter handle?
I think it's David K. Clark.
Okay, I'll add that to the show notes.
But I don't have a website. I don't have anything else that people will be able to contact me via. I'm on LinkedIn, I think, but I never use it.
And you're also in our online community, our Spybury community, which I invite everyone who's listening. If you're not on there, come join us. Just be warned, you will have a ton of recommendations. You'll probably be spending more money on books than you did previously, but it's a wonderful community, and David's in there. So if you've got any questions on any of his picks or feedback on his picks, then do come and share that in our Spybury online community. David, thanks for coming on the show. You've given me a couple of books here that I now need to go and order. Just talking to you about Brierley's book, I read it twice, right? So I read it the first time, I thought, this is great. And then I read it again when he was coming on the show, and he was coming on to talk more about his latest book. But it was interesting to me that even on a second read, I loved it even more. And I was a bit worried that I thought, okay, maybe I got carried away with this one. But no, it's like, it's gone up there in the top 3 for me. And you know,
Yeah.
that's tough to get into those spots.
Yeah, I think I will reread it at some stage. There are so many other books that I want to read first, but it's one of the ones I will definitely come back to.
Marvelous. Well, David, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.